All right, hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. Currently, we are in 2 Samuel chapter 13. Now, this is the beginning of a terrible season for David. And if you will remember, Nathan the prophet told him, predicted this, prophesied this, that disaster would come from David's household. David was forgiven for his sin, but the lingering judgment is, as we will see, some horrendous things will happen as a result of this. Now, one of the things about when we look at God's judgment, and then you can say God's grace, God does not have to physically put his hands on us. There are times when that judgment happens. But understand and know that all God has to do is nothing. Okay? All God has to do is nothing, and disaster will strike us. Much like gravity. Gravity is a continual force that keeps us down. And if you did not have gravity, think about all the horrors that would happen, right? You would float in the ground, but everything else would float also, right? Everything would float up. Right? If you go to the moon, right now there's no gravity on the moon. If you don't, if the astronauts don't worry, they can literally float off into space. So all God has to do is nothing. So God is a continual force through his grace and mercy and love that keeps us. So when we look at this here, this is going to be horrendous how David's life turns out in terms of his, the judgment for his horrendous sin, even though he was forgiven. But all right, chapter 13. And it says, some time passed, and David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister named Tamar, and David's son Ammon was infatuated with her. Now, we see the list of David's sons. Right? He had many sons. We're going to see Absalom and Ammon and Adoniah. And we're going to see that, and then David, look at this. David had all beautiful kids. Some of you all know what I'm getting ready to say, or you're going to know what I mean when I say how there are mothers that take great pride in having pretty kids, right? Some of y'all want to get with a white man so you can have pretty kids. Now that thought is out there. Or you want to get with a pretty guy, or a light-skinned guy, or a guy with good features, so you can have pretty kids. Okay, but David, remember, himself was a very handsome, strikingly handsome man. He was the ultimate man, you could say, and you see in his children the same. They were glamorous to the hilt. All right, so you see this situation here where now, Absalom and Tamar had different mothers than Ammon. So there are a lot of sons of David. Like, for example, Bathsheba, remember, her son is Solomon. And then so there are different, different baby mamas. And this also shows us that when we don't have God's plan or formula, right? You go back to Genesis. In the beginning, God creates man and woman, mother and father. And put like this, let me also add godly mother and father. Okay, so when you kind of get away from that, it's always bad. And then even from the beginning, the idea when you had more than one wives, those situations were never ever ideal. There was always drama, always trouble. Okay, so here we're going to see it in the sons. Okay, so here you have different baby mamas. with different children, and they view each other the way, whose mama has the most clout. All right. By the way, we're going to see it's going to be Bathsheba, though. But anyway, I digress. Verse 2. Ammon was frustrated to the point of making himself sick over his sister Tamar because she was a virgin, but it seemed impossible to do anything to her. Now, you also should point out that David never restrained his kids as well. So, in other words, his kids ran wild in that they grew up wealthy. They grew up in opulence. David really wasn't there, too. Remember, David was, the raising of the kids was left to the mothers. Okay, verse 3. Amnon had a friend named Jonadab, the son of David's brother Shemiel. Jonadab was a very shrewd man, and he asked Amnon, "Why are you, the king's son, so miserable every morning? Why don't you tell me?" In other words, dude, you got it all. Which is kind of, notice the dynamic that's going on here. Jonadab had it, he was hooked up in that he was a part of the family. But then the king's children, guess what, had even more, right? So he said, what do you have to be all upset over? Amnon replied, "I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." Jonadab said to him, "Lie down on your bed and pretend you are sick. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Please let my sister Tamar come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare food in my presence so I can watch and eat it from my hand.'" So now you see why he is shrewd, right? In other words, and then let's add this. Not only is he shrewd, but he's ungodly, because he didn't say, "Dude, she's not your wife. This is ungodly," right? Verse 6. So Amnon lay down and pretended to be sick, and when the king came to see him, Amnon said to him, "Please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my presence so I can eat from her hand." And David sent word to Tamar at the palace, "Please go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare a meal for him." Turn around, right? Think about how the deception here. Remember how David deceived Uriah, and Uriah did not know why David was doing what he was doing. David now doesn't know why his son is doing that, because he wants to rape his daughter. Verse 8, then Tamar went to his house while Amnon was laying down. She took a dough, kneaded it, and made cakes in his presence, and baked them. And she brought the pan and set it down in front of him. But he refused to eat. And Amnon said, "Everyone leave me." And everyone left him. "Bring the meal to my bedroom," Amnon told Tamar, "so I can eat it from your hands." And Tamar took the cakes she had made and went to her brother Ammon's bedroom. Now, at this point, there are a lot of applications we could think of here, right? Tamar doesn't know, because this is her brother. Sleeping and marrying a brother wasn't something unheard of back then. So she doesn't know, because she's not expecting her brother to be a perv. Right? Verse 11. When she brought them to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, "Come sleep with me, my sister." "Don't, my brother," she cried. "Don't humiliate me, for such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this horrible thing. Where could I ever go with my disgrace? And you would be like one of the immoral men of Israel. Please speak to the king, for he will not keep you from me." Now, also, brothers and sisters marrying was not unheard of. They had different mothers, same father. But beyond that, notice here that that's not his point. And by the way, she does fulfill the law, that she cries out, right? She cries out. She's not willing in this. So there's no blame here. Verse 14, but he refused to listen to her, and because he was stronger than she was, he raped her. After this, now Now this is, remember, we have a worse sin here. So he rapes her, which is bad enough, right? But notice now this action. Verse 15. After this, Ammon hated Tamar with such intensity that the hatred he hated her with was greater than the love he loved her with. Get out of here, he said. No, she cried. Sending me away is much worse than the great wrong you've already done to me. But he refused to listen to her. Instead, he called to the servants who waited on him. Throw this woman out, and bolt the door behind her. Now, I have to tell you, I do not understand the mentality here. The swiftness of the change, the hatred. I don't understand that. Other than the fact that he's a wicked, evil man. He loved her and probably experienced those emotions enough. But however, once he gotten what he wanted, the swiftness of the change is amazing to me. How he changed so. Verse 18, Amnon's servants threw her out and bolted the door behind her. Now, Tamar was wearing a long sleeve garment because this was the king's virgin daughter's wore. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore her long sleeve garment she was wearing. She put it on her hand. She put her hand on her head and went away crying out. So that was one of the ways people kind of knew something had happened. Besides her crying out, she tore her clothes, signifying she was no longer a virgin. Verse 20. Her brother Absalom said to her, has your brother Amnon been with you? Be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart. So says a man. So Tamar lived as a desolate woman in the house of her brother Absalom. Okay. Verse 21, and when King David heard about all these things, he was furious. That's it, right? He was just furious. He was mad. Oh, what? Oh. But it kind of shows you the kind of lifestyle. And by the way, this is so common today. When you live with means, when you live wealthy, when you live with privilege, okay? The same happens in any household, right? With any household, it just, you won't see it in the grandiose fashion that you see it here. But David was just furious. Well, but watch the as we move through these stories here, watch the topsy-turvy emotions here. Verse 22. Absalom didn't say anything to Amnon, either good or bad, because he hated Amnon since he disgraced his sister Tamar. And then 2 years later, Absalom's sheep herders were at Baal-Hazor near Ephraim, and Absalom invited the king's son. Then he went to the king and said, your servant has just hired sheep herders. Will the king and his servants please come with your servants? The king replied to Absalom, no, my son, why? We should not at all go, or we would be a burden to you. Although Absalom urged him, he wasn't willing to go, though he did bless him. If not, Absalom said, please let my brother Amnon go with us. The king asked, why should he go with you? It almost sounds like David's like, wait a minute now, Amnon? We know what he did, but But then at the same time, now David is going to override, seem like his instincts here. You feel like, okay, no, you should stay away from Ammon. Why do you want to be? Why do you want Ammon to go with you? And David should have figured this out. You don't mean Ammon good. Verse 27. But Absalom urged him, so he sent Amnon with all the king's sons. The king's sons, by the way, were the cover story. Okay. Verse 28. Now Absalom commanded his young men, watch Amnon until he is good, he's in a good mood from the wine. And when I order you to strike Amnon, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Am I not the one who has commanded you, be strong and courageous? Now, this is kind of a foreshadowing here of Absalom. If you read a few chapters, you'll know what I mean. This is kind of a foreshadowing of his leadership, by the way, and what else this is going to come about. Verse 29. So Absalom, young men, did to Ammon just as Absalom had commanded. Then all the rest of the king's sons got up, and each fled on his mule. And while they were on the way, a report reached David. Absalom struck down all the king's sons. Not even one of them had survived. Now, typical rumors, right? Typical rumors. It wasn't true, but this is how it came to the king. So lesson here, another lesson is always double check rumors, right? Reports. Verse 31. In response, the king stood up and tore his clothes and lay down on the ground, and all the servants stood by with their clothes torn. But Jonadab, the son of David's brother Shimei, spoke up. My lord must not think they have killed all the young men, the king's son, because only Ammon is dead. In fact, Absalom has planned this ever since the day Ammon disgraced his sister Tamar. Now, my lord, the king, don't take seriously the report that says all the king's sons are dead. Only Ammon is dead. So you see this rat here, Jonadab. As he lives up, he's a shrewd person. Now here's the thing. Jonadab will never ever be like a king or king's son. That's just not in the cards for him. But anyway, verse 34. Meanwhile, Absalom had fled. When the young man who was standing watch looked up, there were many people coming from the road west of him from the south of the mountain. So Jonadab said to the king, look, the king's sons have come. It's exactly like your servant said. And just as he finished speaking, the king's sons entered and wept loudly. Then the king and all his servants also wept bitterly. Now Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, king of Gershon. And David mourned for his son every day, meaning Absalom. Absalom had fled and gone to Gershon, where he stayed 3 years. And King David longed to go to Absalom, for David had finished grieving over Amnon's death. Now again, you see this topsy-turvy emotions. On the one hand, he was furious that, Amnon had killed his brother, but then now he longed for his brother. He was also mad at Ammon, obviously, for raping his sister. He got over that pretty quick after he mourned for the death of his son. We're going to see more and more of this kind of topsy-turvy emotion that's going on here. It just, and again, this is all a product of the sinful nature. So let me just say that this is, you may go, well, in our mind, and by the way, things are pretty much the same in our culture, in our day. Don't be judgmental because we're just as sinful. We just pretend like we're kind of righteous. The biblical influence on our culture is good and has affected. The problem with that is we fail to see, or we stop seeing that the sinful nature. We're just as sinful, and if we was in those shoes, we would do the same thing. Alright, it gets worse in that sense from here. Really, from here throughout the end of the book, we're going to see more turbulent times for David. Alright guys, I will see you in the next study, chapter 14. Next study. See you then.